Hey listeners, welcome back to The Abyss. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Brittany.
And I'm Hallie.
And we're really excited to have you here. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow our Instagram, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please give us a 5-star rating. That really helps us make the charts and get more people's feeds. Also, don't forget to visit our website. Every episode we do has a post. We have lots of pictures and our sources and more information on things that we talk about. Like with all of our cases, we really try our hardest to get the correct information, but some cases, this one in particular, was very scattered and there were many different versions of events, many different stories. Everyone kind of had their own account of what happened. Not a lot lined up. So unfortunately, that means that it's kind of hard to know the exact truth, but we did our best to compile information. If we got something wrong, we left something out, or explained something incorrectly, please let us know. We will be happy to issue corrections.
When the Coons family and a family friend decide to go on a camping trip to the great outdoors, all seems well and relaxing until their 2-year-old son disappears without a trace. Everyone chips in to search for the boy, but investigators notice some inconsistencies in the group's stories. Eventually, people start turning on one another. Will the little boy be found? This is the missing persons case of DeOrr Kunz Jr.
So let's jump into the abyss. DeOrr Kunz Jr. was born December 30th, 2012 to Jessica Mitchell and Burrell DeOrr Kunz. He had 2 older half-siblings that stayed with their father, Jessica's ex-husband, and the Coons really enjoyed the outdoors. They went camping a lot. They really liked being out there and taking DeOrr out into nature. So on July 9th, 2015, the family packed up the car and decided to head to the Timber Creek campground in Dior, Idaho. Jessica's grandfather, Robert Walton, known as Bob, was also along on the trip, as well as Bob's friend of 5 years, Isaac Reinwand. Jessica and Vernal had not met Isaac before, but they all decided to meet up at his house before making their way to the campground so they could all put their stuff together and go down as a group. They made the 2.5-hour drive to the campsite with Bob and Isaac riding together and DeOrr and his parents following along in another car. It was almost dark when they got to the Timber Creek campground. They set up the camp and pretty much called it a night. Isaac slept in a tent, Bob was in his camper, and the Coons family slept in the back of Bob's SUV. The following day, on July 10th, the family got up and had breakfast. DeOrr was running around in his little boots, and he was getting in trouble for throwing things in the fire, just little kid stuff. After breakfast, DeOrr went back to sleep until about noon. And it was at that point that Jessica realized that she had gotten her period. So she told Vernal that they needed to go to town immediately and pick up some supplies. They gathered up DeOrr and set off to town about 30 minutes away from the campground. And Vernal decided to use this opportunity to run some errands, like getting gas and stopping at some of the stores. When they finally got to the store for Jessica's supplies, she went to pick up the things that she needed, and she noticed an odd man sitting in a booth drinking coffee. He seemed to be staring at DeOrr, and it made Jessica really uncomfortable. So she really kept an eye on this man as she gathered her things and left to go back to the campground. While they were gone, Bob and Isaac went around to some fishing spots, and they actually caught a good amount of fish.
A little while later, everyone had returned to the campsite. Vernal, Jessica, and DeOrr were back from the store, and Isaac and Bob were back from fishing. Bob mentioned that Isaac should head down to an area about 300 or 400 feet from the campsite where they had caught a lot of fish to show the family. Bob decided to stay behind, though, which isn't really abnormal. He had an oxygen tank with him and had Alzheimer's and may just needed some time to rest. Before heading down to the fishing hole, Vernal told DeOrr that he could stay and play with Grandpa, Bob. DeOrr started following them to the fishing hole anyways, and Vernal noticed him and asked if he was staying with Grandpa or if he was going to go with them. DeOrr then looked and noticed that Bob had some candy with him over at the campsite and decided that he was just going to stay with Grandpa and wandered back towards Bob. Meanwhile, Jessica and Vernal continued to follow Isaac until they reached the fishing spot. After showing them the area, Isaac decided to move to another fishing spot that was located farther down on the creek to do some solo fishing. While Jessica and Vernal were enjoying the great outdoors, they noticed some minnows swimming around and decided to show DeOrr since he absolutely loved seeing fish in the water. Upon returning to the campsite, they soon discovered that little DeOrr was nowhere to be found. Jessica looked in the water to make sure that DeOrr had not fallen in. They asked Bob where DeOrr might be in hopes that he knew, but Bob had no idea. He recalled DeOrr playing with something by a bush while sitting on the ground and figured it was either a car or a shoe or maybe it was just dirt. Bob would later state, quote, "So Isaac and Jessica and Vernal went to go look for fish, and the kid was there with me. But I turned my head for a minute. I don't know for how long. For 5 or 10 minutes? I don't know." End quote. It really struck me as strange that Bob would refer to his grandson as, quote, unquote, the kid. It seems to me like a way of distancing himself from the situation. He also stated, though, that he didn't really love on the kid like women do. So maybe Bob was just a little more tough around the edges. It's really hard to tell, though. Bob was asked if maybe he went into the camper for a moment or so without DeOrr, but Bob denies going inside. Some of the stories get a little fuzzy and contradicting at this point. While doing some research, we saw that Bob mentioned that he thought DeOrr actually went with the others to the fishing spot. This is interesting because he was noted to say that DeOrr wasn't in his care, and then he also was noted to say that he was. This could be contributed to his Alzheimer's, but it's definitely noted as an inconsistency. Another story that seemed out of place was a story provided by Isaac as they went to the fishing spot. Isaac mentioned that he believed that Vernal, DeOrr, and Jessica were all following him to the fishing spot, but he realized that it was just Jessica. This didn't correlate well with the other stories, making it a very intriguing statement. Isaac was still down by the creek fishing when he discovered that DeOrr could not be found. He recalled the event saying, quote, "I was down there fishing for a while, and that's when I noticed Bob was on the ridge pacing back and forth. I asked him what was going on, and he said, 'Little DeOrr is missing.' And I was like, 'What?' I walked up the bank and I talked to Bob a little bit more about where DeOrr might be. We looked in the camper, we looked all around the area and underneath the vehicles. I went up in the hills to where the reservoir was and looked around. Jessica was out in the sagebrush looking. She came back to camp and I talked to her for a little bit. She seemed really upset." End quote. Everyone searched for DeOrr for about 30 minutes, assuming maybe he had wandered off and was just sitting somewhere nearby or had gotten lost. Jessica called her mother, Trina, in desperation and told her that they were unable to find DeOrr. Trina told Jessica to go ahead and call 911 and report it to the police. At 2:28 p.m., an hour after DeOrr was noticed as missing, Jessica called police and reported the incident. We have the audio for you guys to listen to, per usual, and we will discuss it afterwards.
What's the address of your emergency?
I'm actually camping in Ledworth, just outside of Ledworth.
Uh-huh.
My 2-year-old son, we can't find him.
How long has he been missing?
About an hour.
An hour?
Yeah.
Jessica?
Yeah.
Okay. What is he wearing?
He was wearing cowboy boots, a blue, pair, like pajama pants, and a camel jacket.
How tall is he? Hello?
Yes, I'm not exactly sure how. He's about.
What's your name? Burrell? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. Is your husband calling too?
Like all down where we were camping at, and we can't find him at all.
Okay, we need you to stay within cell service. We've got people going on the way.
Thank you.
You can hear in the call that Vernal's in the background talking to what sounds like a 911 operator as well. So we're going to play that little bit for you again just so you can hear it in case you missed it the first time.
What's your name? Burrell? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is interesting because in Vernal's version of events, he said he realized he didn't have good cell service and he drove about 1.5 miles down the road so he could make the 911 call while Jessica remained at the camp. But obviously they were both in the same place. They both had good enough cell service to make the calls that they needed to. So that's just kind of an odd inconsistency with his story. And before Jessica called 911, she actually called her mom and told her what was going on and asked what she should do. So it's pretty clear that cell service wasn't as shaky as they make it seem sometimes. Search crews soon arrived and the search for DeOrr really kicked off. Lynn Bowerman was the Lemhi County Sheriff there at the scene, and around this time, police received a tip from someone in Lador about seeing a man with a younger boy matching DeOrr's description driving a black truck around 6 p.m. The person said that the child was dirty and crying and that the man was buying him candy. This kind of piqued their interest because Vernal did drive a black truck, but he was at the campsite assisting in the search at this time, so it didn't really make sense for him to be in two places at once, basically. So they pretty much wrote it off as not being Vernal, but we still don't know who that was, who that little boy was, or any of that. So whether or not it was connected is kind of unclear. Some people think that the tipster may have been confused about the time and simply remembered when Vernal and Jessica had gone to town earlier that day, but it didn't really fit with the timeline, so this tip pretty much just remained a mystery. The next day on July 11th, the searches continued. They used ATVs, helicopters, horseback, and foot searches. They even sent divers into the bodies of water nearby. A 2.5-mile radius of the campsite was searched, but the primary focus was on the creek that was about 15 yards away from the site. This was searched over and over again to no avail. Nothing turned up, no piece of clothing, no evidence at all. On July 12th, 200 volunteers showed up to aid in the search for DeOrr. One of the volunteers was interviewed later, and he said that the parents seemed quote-unquote off. He knew the area well, and he said that an animal attack or an abduction was a super far-fetched story. An animal attack would leave a lot more evidence and wouldn't just be so clean, and that abduction would be hard because there was one road in and out of the campsite. So it would be hard for someone to travel down that long single road unnoticed and kidnap a kid and then drive all the way out. So he doesn't think that that's plausible at all. On July 13th, the volunteer search was suspended for fear that this may not have been a simple situation of a child wandering off, and investigators did not want the scene to be contaminated by the hundreds of people just traipsing through. Jessica and Vernal stated at this point that they believed their son was abducted. They held a candlelight vigil that night and gave tearful interviews to the media, just pleading for their son to be returned and for their family to come back together. That same evening, a cashier from a Walmart about 120 miles away from the campsite called police. This cashier told them that a man had been in with a blonde-haired, hazel-eyed little boy buying diapers. This tip raised hope that DeOrr would soon be home, but when the man was tracked down, it turned out that the boy was not DeOrr. Over the next few days, the search continued. Dive crews searched other bodies of water in the area and even used a sonar robot to search the murky waters. Searchers on horseback also searched the hills near the campsite, and a representative from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children arrived during that time as well. By July 18th, which was Vernal's birthday, the Coons were still at the campsite waiting on any piece of evidence.
Evidence had been so hard to find that they couldn't even be sure that DeOrr was ever at the campsite. There was no DNA, no traces, no photographs, and no signs that an animal attack had occurred. There was absolutely nothing for law enforcement to go off of except for the family's statements and anyone who may have been nearby. Law enforcement talked to 2 men from Oregon who were spreading one of their father's ashes in the reservoir. The men talked to DeOrr's parents and law enforcement. They claimed that the police seemed more interested in what the Coons family was saying rather than their possible involvement in the case. In conclusion, the 2 people were no longer discussed. Another family was supposedly camping in an area of the campground nearby, and Sheriff Bowerman said that they did not question those people, but they did contact law enforcement in their respective town. The police told Bowerman that they were good people and would not suspect them of anything, and that was kind of where that was left to conclude. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me because if they didn't question those people, they had to at least found out where they were from to be able to contact law enforcement in that area. But if you're talking to them about those kind of details, why not just question them anyway?
Just contacting law enforcement in the area and being like, hey, are these good people? That's not good investigative work at all.
Roughly 3 months later in August, there was still no sign of DeOrr. A man named Frank Vilt, who was a private investigator and a family friend to the Coons family, offered to assist them in the search for their son. Frank had been with the U.S. Marshal Service for 19 years and genuinely wanted to help the family. However, a few weeks after taking the case, Frank suddenly resigned. The reasoning behind his resignation, you may ask, was because he believed that the parents were lying and misleading him and that Jessica may have arranged to give DeOrr away. Frank said, quote, "I told both of you that if I felt you were not telling the truth, stalling me, or otherwise misleading me, that I would withdraw from the investigation. In my professional opinion, both of you lied and misrepresented the true facts that could solve the mystery of your missing son." End quote. A person who is a family friend, retired U.S. Marshal, and private investigator believes that you are lying and misleading the investigation doesn't look too good on that perspective. However, there is no substantial proof, and the search effort just continues. Around the time of Frank's resignation, a post on Facebook revealed a picture of a child that was found in a motel in California. Even though this gave some hope to the family and investigators, it ended up being a dead end. To expand their search and awareness, billboards started to go up with hopes of increasing tips on the case.
In November of 2015, a private investigator, Philip Klein, was hired to look at the case by DeOrr's paternal grandfather. A GoFundMe page was started to raise money to aid in the investigation, and it raised over $20,000. Philip had over 20 hours of interview footage with Jessica, Vernal, and Bob. He looked into the past of each of them and kind of tried to understand more of who they were and what their stories were. Jessica was said to have a short fuse with her kids and allegedly even left DeOrr at daycare past the allotted time or would just leave him unattended. Philip felt like her giving up custody of her two older children just showed her character as a detached parent, but she maintains that she gave custody to her ex-husband because he was financially stable and could take better care of the kids. She and Vernal had both lost their jobs, so she said she just felt like it was best for them to be in a stable environment like that. Isaac had a more sordid past. Supposedly, he had been diagnosed as bipolar. He also had been arrested on a felony rape charge in the past that was lessened to a misdemeanor domestic battery. He was not officially considered a sex offender, but with a violent charge in his past, investigators just sort of kept that in mind. According to Jessica, Isaac did not help with the search, choosing instead to drink in his tent and not come out to help searchers or help in any of the efforts. This contradicts his own story, so again, there's some conflict there. Jessica's grandfather, Bob, had many health problems. Like we said, he had Alzheimer's, and Jessica was his caretaker. With each interview, a new story would come up. None of the people involved could really tell a consistent story except for Isaac. Almost immediately, the whole family started turning on each other. Jessica said that she always thought it was Isaac, that she was sure that he had something to do with it. She also said there were a lot of red flags with Isaac, that he was gone from the campsite more than anyone else. She claimed that he repeatedly reset his phone to factory settings after the incident, which made her think that he was hiding something. She even said when Isaac realized DeOrr was coming on the trip, he became extremely agitated about it. And she had a very odd story involving the time that DeOrr went missing. She said that Isaac had brought a shovel on the trip, and that after DeOrr went missing, she saw the shovel again. At this point, the shovel had a blonde hair on it that matched DeOrr's hair, and this really raised an alarm with Jessica, so she told the police. And supposedly they took Isaac out of the campsite to interview him, and when he got back, he went right to the shovel and started rubbing his hands all over it, which is pretty odd. I don't even know what he would think that he was doing, if that's true. Like, obviously, it would have his fingerprints on it previously because it was his, so I'm not sure what that would be for.
Yeah, part of me wonders if maybe she's saying he went and rubbed his hands all over it, but maybe he was going and just, like, inspecting it, and she was just kind of dramatizing that. Or maybe he did go and grope the shovel. I don't know.
Yeah, that's sort of an odd account of events. She said she tried to grab the blonde hair on the shovel, but the wind blew it away, and it was just lost forever. In Bob's interview, he said he did not trust Isaac. He said that he brought him along if something happened to Bob. He said something along the lines of he needed someone there in case he keeled over. Jessica was tasked as his caretaker, so it seems kind of odd that he would bring someone he didn't like or trust on the trip just to be there in case something happened. In the interview, the interviewer asked Bob if he would trust Isaac to stay the night at his house, and Bob said no. He was asked if he would trust Isaac to watch his great-grandson, and he said no. He was asked if he would trust Isaac not to steal his money, and again, he said no. So the interviewer then asked, why is he friends with Isaac at all? And Bob said, that's a good question. So that's such an odd dynamic to me. Like, you would think a small family camping trip, you would only invite people that you trusted, people that you wanted to be around. Like, why he was there in the first place is still sort of strange to me. Isaac is the only one that kept a fairly consistent story, though. Even though everyone's kind of pointing fingers at him, he kept telling the interviewers the same thing. His story didn't really change much. And he pretty much refused to point fingers at anyone. He tried to stay out of it. He said he wanted to stay neutral because he didn't really know what happened. All of the information Philip Klein was getting was making him more and more suspicious, and eventually he sat down with the family and said, quote, I was very clear. I said, you're not going to like what I have to say. And it was like, oh my God, these two people are suspects, end quote. Philip offered $20,000 to the family to help in search efforts, but they refused the money. And once Philip made these allegations, Vernal Coons refused to keep working with him, and he was dropped from the case.
After Philip was fired from the case, he was quickly rehired anonymously to dig into the case again. He decided to go back to the campsite to either prove or disprove the statements made by the parents. He believed that one or more of the parents committed a crime in this case and were hiding the truth. Jane Holmes, a private investigator who was working with Philip at the time, had her own theory of what happened to DeOrr. She believed that he died before the trip and that the story was just a cover-up. Ironically, there were no photographs from the trip, and Jessica was known to take many pictures of DeOrr, but there were absolutely none. Not from packing up to go, being en route, or at the campground at all. At first, Jessica says that she didn't post photos due to a lack of cell service, but they had at least some on the way out there. And then she said that she didn't take any at all because she just wanted a relaxing vacation. Interestingly, the parents denied to go on many media outlets such as Nancy Grace and Good Morning America, and they only made one appearance. When this was addressed with them, they said they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't, and they just wanted to spend more time looking for DeOrr rather than answering the same questions. I understand their reasoning, but I also feel that publicity really matters. So one person should want to raise as much awareness as possible for their son, especially on big outlets like the ones mentioned. Even just going on Good Morning America once would have provided them with a lot of good publicity. On another account, Philip mentioned blood evidence on Vernal's truck and that DeOrr died of blunt force trauma. He also noted that Jessica admitted to knowing where the body of DeOrr was. Obviously, Jessica denies ever saying any of this. Jessica and Vernal had their attorney ask Philip for the evidence to back up his claim, but nothing was ever provided to them. The Coons believe that Philip was really only in this for the money, and as soon as he got it, he supposedly turned and pointed the finger at them.
In June of 2016, an intensive 5-day investigation was put together by Philip Klein to prove or disprove the statements surrounding the case.
I don't know about a big break. I think it will happen faster than I think we even thought. I think the investigators are, we're never happy with a case like this, but I think we're satisfied that the case is moving faster than we thought it would move. I think we are focused on the incident of that day, the timeline. There are some things that match, some things that don't match. And so I think we go back through now that timeline and we try to piece together that day.
Philip Klein and Jane Holmes worked with Tracy Surgeon and her search dog Chance, the Bonneville and Lemhi County Police, the FBI, and the KIC Texas Child Rescue Team. They also worked with Frank Viltz, the other private investigator, so they had a lot of information and resources for this investigation. Every attempt to verify Jessica and Vernal's stories pretty much failed. The phone ping information indicated that Vernal had lied about driving that couple miles out of the campsite to find cell service for the 911 call. We know cell phone information can be notoriously bad, so this alone would take a lot more to be fully confirmed, but with Vernal clearly heard in the back of that phone call you heard earlier, it adds a little bit of credibility to the fact that that little drive never happened. Jessica was told she would have immunity if she just told them where the body was, but she said she didn't know and she would never sign anything like that. 2 separate searches were done with dogs. The first search yielded 5 different hits, some of which were handed over to law enforcement agencies to check out, and some were just seen to be nothing. The first was a diaper tree where DeOrr's parents said they hung his diapers, and 1 diaper was found there. There was another hit about 139 feet east of the campsite, but nothing was found there. Another hit turned out to be a site where an animal had been buried, and the person that did that had bled on a cloth that was buried with the animal, so that provided the hit, but it didn't have anything to do with DeOrr's case. And there were 2 other sites, one about 2¼ miles from the campsite and another about 3/4 of a mile from the campsite. And those were looked at and handed over to law enforcement, but no word came out as to if they found anything or if they were just sort of left. The second search revealed 2 places of interest, but again, we don't know exactly what was found there, if anything. Jessica's mother's house was searched, but no hits were made there. The home that Jessica and Vernal had recently been evicted from was searched, and they had left a lot of stuff behind. Among these were 4 Matchbox cars. It had been previously stated that the parents were not sure where these were, but the exact significance of these specific cars is kind of unclear. Investigators also found a camo jacket that matched the one that DeOrr was said to be wearing when he disappeared. So maybe he had 2, maybe he had a bunch of different camo jackets or something like that, but it was a little suspicious to find the clothing that he was said to be in when he disappeared. The last interesting thing that was found was a tracking device that's used by insurance companies to track driving practices. It had either not yet been installed or had been removed before the trip, and to some people this seemed like an attempt to cover up GPS tracking or something like that.
The family was also questioned during this intensive investigation, and some of the collective results were released to the public. I will be saying this almost word for word from Philip Klein's report to make sure that I convey the information accurately, and we will have a link for that on our website if you would like to read it. It noted that Vernal Coons had been deceptive, failed 5 polygraphs, and had provided 6 varying stories to law enforcement. He was also a suspect in homicide. Jessica Mitchell had failed 4 polygraphs and told 5 varying stories to law enforcement, as well as being a suspect in homicide. Jessica and Vernal specifically struggled during the polygraphs on questions that related to what happened to DeOrr and his whereabouts currently. Bob Walton was noted as being deceptive. He told 2 varying stories and had an inconclusive polygraph. He was also stated to be a person of interest in homicide. And lastly, Isaac Reinwand was noted by investigators to be truthful. He told the same story 4 times and had an inconclusive polygraph due to his mental condition and is considered to be a person of interest in homicide. Investigators working with Philip Klein during the 5-day targeted investigation released some interesting statements based on their findings. They stated that Jessica and Vernal were being deceptive and they believed the investigation was a homicide rather than a missing persons case. However, they do believe the case is solvable and has not gone cold. They concluded that there was no evidence to prove that DeOrr was ever at the campsite except for the family's statements. Interestingly, they also said that the parents could have begun a misinformation operation to influence the jury, confuse media outlets, the public, law enforcement, and investigators. It's believed the parents are doing this through family and friends on social media as a small group. And lastly, investigators said that they were unable to find a single witness that saw DeOrr with the family when they went to the store in Lador. Due to this conclusion, police moved the start of the incident's timeline to 5 p.m. the day before DeOrr was discovered as missing. Jessica also met with a sketch artist about the man who she had seen staring at DeOrr when they went to town, and investigators supposedly talked to the man, and the individual said that he did not recall the event.
In October of 2016, Sheriff Lynn Bowerman retired, and a new Sheriff Steve Penner took his place. Sheriff Bowerman had always been pretty steadfast in believing DeOrr's parents were responsible for his disappearance. He said, quote, "We've given them too many opportunities to tell us what happened if it was an accident. There's been no interest in going that direction, so that tells me there's only one other possibility. It has to be a homicide," end quote. Honestly, this is a little absurd to me. I understand the suspicion surrounding the family, but to say that the only possibility is murder because the parents won't admit to an accident is a little bit irresponsible. Even Philip Klein's investigation relied heavily on just like interviews and gut intuition, given that the cell phone tower data and the cadaver dogs and stuff like that can be pretty unreliable. So there's no real forensic evidence that could be substantiated. So to claim to be sure about what happened either means they know a lot more that they're not sharing, or there's a lot of liberties being taken with the story. Where Bowerman is kind of all over the theory that the parents did it, Penner has taken the other extreme. He said, quote, "Other people have called them suspects, but I'm not committed to that theory. You can't just pursue one theory," end quote. Which on its face sounds like a responsible approach, but he later says he's sure that the parents had nothing to do with it. And in all of his interviews, he's very wishy-washy about answering questions. He avoids eye contact almost to a comical degree. And it could just be kind of social anxiety, but he can't really seem to answer any question about the direction the investigation is taking at any time. He seems to be unbothered by stating things he believes to be true without actually backing them up. So I think that both Sheriff Bowerman and Sheriff Penner have their issues relating to this case. In 2017, a lawsuit was filed against Philip Klein for libel, fraud, breach of contract, and slander, among other things. In response to this, Philip issued a statement asking the DA to charge Jessica and Vernal with child endangerment at minimum. Philip thinks that he was only fired because he was getting too close to the truth, but a lot of people think that Philip was only in it for the money and the notoriety and was actually a detriment to the case. The lawsuit was later dismissed. In April of 2019, a national nonprofit called Search for Me took the case on.
In June 2019, an investigator named David Marshburn joined the case. Trina Clegg, Jessica's mother, said, quote, "David's come here with a lot of his own money. He said he didn't expect me to give him a dime. I offered to help feed him and let him stay in my home, but as a PI and trying to stay neutral, he can't do that. He said, I don't expect you to do anything for me. You are the family member of a missing child and I don't expect that. David and I have become very close, and I talk to him on a very regular basis, and I just feel like he brings a lot of hope to the case." End quote. David took cadaver dogs to the campsite and got a hit for possible human remains. This resulted in the Timber Creek campground being closed for another complete investigation lasting from June 28th through July 1st. Sheriff Steve Penner refused to comment on their findings, if anything at all, but he said that they would follow up as quote-unquote environmental conditions changed. Sadly, Bob Watson died of cancer in this same month. He was interviewed by police the day before he passed away, taking to the grave with him any information that was left unsaid. Trina Clegg, Bob's daughter, said that Bob seemed to feel guilty about something, but he obviously was dealing with a lot of stress from the investigation and was on his deathbed, making this statement pretty hard to rely on.
We've pretty much mentioned the theories throughout the case, but we'll kind of lay them out again for you just to make everything a little bit more clear. The first is the animal attack theory, but this has been discredited by pretty much everyone. There's no evidence, and animal attacks tend to leave traces. The next theory is one believed by Dior's parents, and that's abduction. Supposedly, there's a place above the reservoir where you can stand and kind of see the campsite, but it's obscured from view of being seen. And the theory is that someone was up there watching the family, ran down, quickly grabbed Dior, and escaped without notice. This kind of seems far-fetched to me as well. That seems like a lot to happen in a short amount of time.
Yeah, I agree. It would have had to have been a very targeted attack, and there would have had to have been at least 2 or more people. Someone standing up there watching them would not have been able to make it all the way down there, snatch him, and all the way out of sight before Vernal and Jessica returned back to the campsite, or before Bob came out of the camper or turned back around or anything like that.
Yeah, and there were no screams, no noises, no shoes kicked off, nothing like that. So that would have to be a very stealthy and well-planned attack. The next theory is one that the parents are guilty of either doing something to Dior or covering up what happened. Some think that the parents killed him by accident or on purpose on the trip. This is evidenced by, like we said before, Jessica allegedly told one of Klein's investigators that she knew where the body was. Without proof of this and with her denying it, there's not much to that. There's also the theory that Frank Viltz kind of put forward, saying that the trip was schemed to give Dior away or to sell him, give him up for adoption, something like that. And that maybe the trip into town was to drop him off with someone, and then they just sort of manipulated Bob in a fragile mental state to think that he had seen Dior. Again, I don't really put a lot of credibility into that, just from like a logical perspective, but it could have happened. And the fact that someone so seasoned in law enforcement puts forth that theory, I think gives it a little bit of credibility. Like, he must have had a pretty good reason to think that, but I just don't see evidence for it. Some people think that Isaac did something to DeOrr, and that when he said he was fishing, he was really disposing of the body. Some people, like Jane Holmes, think that DeOrr was never on the camping trip to begin with, and that it was all just a cover-up. I tend to gravitate toward this theory. If something nefarious did go down, I think this would be the theory I would be most inclined to believe. It has very Casey Anthony vibes to me, and I think that without pictures or any evidence, I think it's entirely plausible that he was just never there in the first place.
Not to mention that the jacket that DeOrr was supposedly wearing when he went missing was found in Jessica and Vernal's home.
Yeah, so I can definitely see them using the camping trip as sort of an excuse, because a kid wandering off or being abducted or something wouldn't be their fault, and maybe it had something to do with things they didn't want coming out, or it was just them shirking responsibility. I don't know, but that could have happened. The other scenario in my mind that kind of makes sense is that he just simply wandered off. Toddlers don't really have logic, and often when they're lost, they find small places to hide in. They wedge themselves somewhere, so it can be really hard to find them. They might not answer when you call. I've seen many cases where areas were thoroughly searched for missing hikers and children, only to have their bodies turn up in a previously searched area. So the fact that nothing was found so far doesn't really mean this didn't happen. Cadaver dogs are notoriously unreliable in certain situations, and we've talked about that before. There's just lots of cases where they get things wrong, where they have false positives or they don't find something, and they themselves are not evidence. So their hits or lack of hits don't necessarily mean anything concrete. So those are the main theories. We'd love to know what you think, and if you have any other theories or insights or evidence that we may not have mentioned. So be sure to contact us if you have any other information. Jessica and Vernal ended up separating, and Jessica has since married someone else. As we said, Bob passed away, and the other three that were on that trip don't really talk anymore. Vernal said that he's not given up hope, that he carries DeOrr's favorite stuffed monkey with him everywhere he goes. And he said that he used to drink heavily, but now he tries to live life as if DeOrr is going to walk through that door any moment, and he wants to make him proud. Some people in the community are supportive, while others still taunt and harass and even threaten the family. So there's definitely still a divide even all this time later.
We have photos on our website, theabysspod.com. So go on there and check it out so you can see what DeOrr looks like. He is a missing person, so you want to be able to have that visual in case you see him. And we have age progression photos up there too, so you can compare what he did look like versus what he would look like now. DeOrr Kunz Jr. is a white male with blonde hair and brown eyes. He was 2 years old at the time of his disappearance and weighed 28 pounds and was 3 feet tall. If you have any tips or information, you can call either 911, 1-800-THE-LOST, or 1-208-756-8980. And we'll have all of those on our website in case you didn't get them right now. So that way you can go give any tips if you have any and help find this poor missing child.
So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to, and please give us a 5-star rating. You can follow our social media to get all the updates on cases.
And if you really like this podcast and want to share it with your friends, you're able to share our posts from our Facebook page.
We really want to reach more people and get more awareness to these cases and build a bigger community. So help us out with that, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for jumping into the abyss with us.
Around the time of Frank's resignation.
Brittany was truck driver, okay.
And we move on. No, help me.
Lord help.
So maybe Bod was just Bod.
Oh god. Oh, that was my eyes. I saw something move. It was just the floater in my eyes. saying it right now.
I'm OCD.
We're never gonna look at this again.
But you're saying this one, so I just put it right there too, so that way, because you said for Klein twice. I just see, just go. It's fine.
Klein offered $20,000 to the.
Look, don't jump on me, Brittany. Oh my God, now I gotta change that one. Jessica's. Why can't I say Jessica's name?